Welcome back to another journey through the corridors of time. Tonight, we're stepping into the smoky, thundering world of the 19th century Industrial Revolution, where the rhythm of machines replaced the rhythm of seasons, and where human lives were measured not in contentment, but in hours worked and wages earned. Please consider subscribing to the channel and hit the like button. Settle yourself comfortably now, okay? And let your mind drift back to a time when the very air itself was thick with possibility and peril. Imagine yourself walking through the narrow, cobbled streets of Manchester or Birmingham, where the sky hangs perpetually gray with coal smoke, and the sound of machinery echoes from every direction like some great mechanical heartbeat. The world you're about to enter is one of profound transformation, where centuries-old ways of life crumbled beneath the weight of steam and steel. Here, children as young as 6 years old worked alongside massive, dangerous machinery, their small fingers nimble enough to tie broken threads, while enormous wheels turned inches from their faces. Here, entire families crowded into single rooms, their lives dictated by the factory bell that rang before dawn and long after dusk. Yet, this was also a world of remarkable human resilience, where ordinary people, mill workers, match girls, and countless others found ways to survive, to resist, and sometimes even to triumph against overwhelming odds. Their stories, told in the gentle cadence of history, remind us of both how far we've come and how precious our modern comforts truly are. Tonight, we'll walk through 4 distinct windows into this vanished world. First, into the deafening halls of a textile mill where children worked among dangerous machinery. Then, into the story of brave young women who dared to strike against impossible conditions. Next, into the scientific mysteries that revealed just how poisoned the industrial world had become. And finally, to the stark contrast between the workers' tenements and the factory owners' mansions. Close your eyes now. Let the Industrial Revolution unfold around you like a dream made of smoke and steel, where every story whispers of human endurance in the face of an age that transformed everything it touched. The factory bell pierces the pre-dawn darkness at 4:30 in the morning, its metallic clang reverberating through the narrow streets of industrial Manchester. You are 10 years old, and this sound has become as familiar to you as your own heartbeat. Your bare feet touch the cold, wooden floor of the cramped room you share with your mother, 2 younger siblings, and sometimes a lodger who pays a few pence to sleep in the corner. The air is thick with the smell of coal smoke and the faint, sweet scent of machine oil that seems to cling to everything in this part of the city. Your mother is already moving in the darkness, her movements quick and efficient from years of this same routine. She presses a piece of yesterday's bread into your small, hand-hard bread. But bread, nonetheless, sand wraps a thin shawl around your shoulders. The November air outside will be bitter, and the factory, though warm from the machines, offers no comfort in its early morning chill. Your stomach growls softly, a sound you've learned to ignore as the bread barely fills the hollow ache that has become your constant companion. The walk to Cromford Mill takes you through streets that seem to exist in perpetual twilight. Gas lamps flicker weakly against the encroaching darkness, casting long shadows that dance with the movement of other small figures making their way to work. You pass other children, some younger than yourself, their faces pale and drawn in the dim light. Mary, who works at the machine next to yours, walks beside you in comfortable silence. At 8 years old, she has already been working for 2 years, and her small hands bear the telltale scars of countless counters with moving machinery. The mill building looms before you like a great brick cathedral dedicated to industry rather than worship. Its windows glow with the warm yellow light of oil lamps, and even from the street, you can hear the rhythmic thunder of the machines inside, a sound that will surround you for the next 14 hours. The building stretches 4 stories high, its red brick facade blackened with soot, its tall windows designed more for light than beauty. Smoke pours from its chimney stacks in thick, gray columns that merge with the perpetual cloud cover hanging over the city. Inside, the heat hits you immediately. The air is thick and humid, heavy with cotton fiber that floats through the atmosphere like indoor snow. Your lungs, still small and developing, struggle momentarily with the dense air before adapting to what will be your breathing environment for the day. Sound is overwhelming. Hundreds of spinning frames clatter and hum in mechanical harmony, creating a din so constant that conversation becomes nearly impossible. You've learned to read lips and communicate through hand signals. Adaptations that seem natural now, but would have been unthinkable in your previous life in the countryside. Your workstation awaits you at frame number 47, a massive spinning machine that stands nearly 8 feet tall and stretches 20 feet in length. The machine is a marvel of engineering, its hundreds of spindles turning in perfect synchronization, drawing cotton fibers into strong, continuous thread. But to you, it is both provider and predator, the source of your family's survival and the constant threat to your safety. The machine requires constant attention. Broken threads must be tied immediately. Spindles must be cleaned, and the cotton must be fed continuously into the apparatus. You slip beneath the moving machinery with the fluid grace that only a child can possess. Your small stature, which in any other context would be a disadvantage, becomes your greatest asset here. Adult workers cannot fit into the narrow spaces between the spinning frames, cannot reach the threads that break in the machine's depths, cannot move with the speed and agility required to keep the production flowing. Your nimble fingers work with practiced efficiency, tying broken threads with tiny, precise knots that will hold under the machine's tension. The work requires a particular kind of concentration, a state of relaxed alertness that allows you to respond instantly to the machine's needs while maintaining awareness of the dangerous moving parts surrounding you. The spinning frames have no safety guards, no protective barriers between your small body and the powerful gears and wheels that could crush a limb in an instant. You've learned to work with a kind of meditation, your movements becoming almost unconscious, your mind entering a state where time seems to slow and the world narrows to the immediate task at hand. The overseer, Mr. Hartwell, patrols the factory floor with the measured steps of a man who has learned to read the rhythm of production. He is not an unkind man, but he is a practical one, and his job depends on maintaining the output that the factory owners demand. His eyes are constantly moving, watching for signs of fatigue, carelessness, or the kind of momentary lapse in attention that could result in injury or damage to the expensive machinery. When he speaks, his voice must be raised above the din of the machines, giving even casual conversation the urgency of a shout by mid-morning. The heat in the factory has become oppressive. The combination of human bodies, oil-burning lamps, and the friction of hundreds of moving machines creates an atmosphere that would challenge even the hardiest adult. Your thin cotton dress clings to your small frame, and beads of perspiration gather on your forehead despite your youth. The air shimmers with heat waves, and the cotton fibers floating through the atmosphere seem to dance in the rising currents of warm air. The first break comes at 11:30, a precious 15 minutes when the machines fall silent and the sudden absence of sound feels almost supernatural. Your ears ring in the quiet, and you realize that the constant noise has become such a part of your environment that its absence feels strange and unsettling. You sit on the wooden floor beside your machine, sharing a small piece of cheese with Mary. The two of you eating in companionable silence as your bodies adjust to the temporary respite. During these brief interludes, you sometimes catch glimpses of the world beyond the factory walls through the tall windows. The view shows other factories, other smoking chimneys, other buildings dedicated to the great industrial transformation that has swept across England like a tide. But sometimes, on clear days, you can make out the green hills beyond the city, a reminder of the countryside where you were born, and which now seems as distant as a fairy tale. The afternoon brings its own challenges. K begins to set in, and with it, the increased risk of accidents. K, your movements, so fluid and automatic in the morning, begin to require more conscious effort. K, the heat continues to build, creating an almost trance-like state where time seems to stretch and compress unpredictably. Minutes feel like hours, but suddenly you realize that hours have passed like minutes. K, and the light coming through the windows has shifted from the bright white of midday to the golden amber of late afternoon. It is during these drowsy afternoon hours that accidents most commonly occur. The combination of fatigue, heat, and the hypnotic rhythm of the machines creates a dangerous environment where momentary lapses in attention can have serious consequences. You've learned to fight against this drowsiness, to maintain the sharp edge of awareness that keeps you safe. But you've also witnessed what happens when that vigilance fails. Last month, you watched as Tommy, a boy of 12 who worked at the frame beside yours, caught his sleeve in a moving belt. The machine pulled him forward with irresistible force, and in a split second, before the overseer could reach the lever to stop the frame, Tommy's arm was drawn into the machinery. The sound of his scream cut through the factory noise like a blade, and the sight of his blood on the cotton threads created a stark, red contrast against the white fibers that would haunt your dreams for weeks afterward. Tommy survived, but his arm had to be amputated above the elbow. He returned to work after 6 weeks, learning to operate a single-handed frame at reduced wages. His accident was noted in the factory's ledger book as carelessness, resulting in damage to equipment and loss of production, with no mention of the permanent disability that would affect him for the rest of his life. Such incidents are common, enough that they barely interrupt the flow of production, accepted as an inevitable cost of industrial progress. The day's final hours stretch before you like a long, dim tunnel. Your back aches from hours of bending and stretching. Your feet throb from standing on the hard wooden floor, and your hands, though skilled and quick, bear the small cuts and abrasions that are the unavoidable marks of your trade. The cotton fibers in the air have coated your throat and lungs, giving your voice a rough, scratchy quality that all mill workers share. As the sun begins to set, casting long shadows through the factory windows, you find yourself entering a strange state of endurance. Your body continues to work with mechanical precision, while your mind begins to drift. Seek an escape from the physical discomfort and monotony. You imagine yourself in the countryside of your birth, running through fields of actual grass rather than cotton, breathing air that tastes of rain and earth rather than oil and fiber. The final bell rings at 8:30 in the sudden silence. As the machines wind down, feels like a physical relief. Your body, which has been tensed against the noise and vibration for 14 hours, finally begins to relax. The walk home through the darkened streets is a quiet procession of exhausted workers, their faces pale and drawn into flickering gaslight, their bodies moving with the measured pace of people who have learned to conserve their energy for the next day's ordeal. At home, your mother has prepared a simple meal of porridge and a small piece of salted pork, a feast by the standards of your new life. You eat in grateful silence, your body too tired for conversation, your mind too numb for anything but the basic necessity of nourishment. The food, though simple, tastes extraordinary after the long day, and you find yourself appreciating flavors and textures with an intensity that your previous life could never have provided. As you lie down on your small mattress, sharing the warmth of thin blankets with your siblings, you reflect on the strange transformation that has brought you to this place. 6 months ago, you were a child of the countryside, your days measured by the sun and seasons, your responsibilities limited to simple farm chores and the occasional errand. Now, you are a vital part of a great industrial machine. You're small hands contributing to the production of textiles that will be shipped around the world. The transition has been neither easy nor comfortable, but it has brought a kind of pride that you struggle to understand. You are no longer dependent on the unpredictable bounty of the land. You have become part of something larger and more powerful than yourself. Your work, though difficult and dangerous, has purpose and value in the new world that is emerging around you. The threads you tie, the bobbins you tend, the machines you feed, all of these contribute to a transformation that extends far beyond the factory walls. Sleep comes quickly in your exhausted state, but it is often interrupted by dreams of spinning wheels and moving belts, of the endless rhythm of machinery that has become the soundtrack of your life. Sometimes you dream of the countryside, of open fields and clean air, but these dreams feel increasingly distant, like memories of someone else's life rather than your own. Tomorrow will bring another day identical to this one, another 14 hours of heat and noise and careful attention to dangerous machinery. But tonight, in the brief respite between one day's labor and the next, you rest in the knowledge that you have survived another day in the new world of steam and steel, that your small hands have contributed to the great transformation that is reshaping civilization itself. In the morning, the bell will ring again, and you will rise to meet another day in the kingdom of machines. The weeks pass in a blur of mechanical routine, each day flowing into the next with the relentless consistency of the factory bell. You begin to understand that time itself has been transformed by the industrial age, no longer measured by the natural rhythm of sunrise and sunset, but by the artificial divisions created by steam whistles and production schedules. The ancient connection between human life and the turning of seasons has been severed, replaced by a new kind of temporal order that serves the needs of machinery rather than the needs of human beings. Winter arrives early that year, bringing with it challenges that extend far beyond the factory walls. The narrow streets of Manchester become treacherous with ice and snow, and the walk to work transforms into a daily ordeal of slipping and sliding through the darkness. Your thin shoes, already worn from months of factory work, provide little protection against the cold and wet. The leather has cracked and separated, allowing moisture to seep through and freeze against your skin. By the time you reach the mill each morning, your feet are numb and your stockings are soaked through. Inside the factory, the contrast between the bitter cold outside and the oppressive heat of the spinning room becomes even more pronounced. The sudden transition from freezing air to the warm, humid atmosphere of the mill creates a shock to your system that leaves you dizzy and disoriented for the first hour of each day. Your body struggles to adapt to these extreme temperature changes, and you find yourself developing a persistent cough that rattles in your chest like a miniature version of the machines that surround you. The cough is not uncommon among mill workers. The combination of cotton fibers in the air, the dampness required to keep the threads from breaking, and the constant temperature variations creates an environment that is particularly harsh on developing lungs. You notice that many of the older workers have a distinctive pallor and a shortness of breath that seems to worsen as the months pass. Mrs. Patterson, who has worked in the mill for 15 years, can barely climb the stairs to the upper floors without stopping to rest. Her breathing, labored and painful to hear. The mill's atmosphere becomes even more challenging as winter deepens. The windows, which might have been opened for ventilation in warmer months, remain tightly closed against the cold, trapping the cotton fibers and oil vapors inside. The air becomes thick and stagnant, heavy with the exhalation of hundreds of workers and the emissions from the oil lamps that provide illumination during the long winter days. You learn to breathe shallowly, taking in only what air you need. Deeper breaths result in coughing fits that can last for minutes. Your daily routine adapts to accommodate the new challenges of winter. You rise even earlier now, allowing extra time for the treacherous walk to work. Your mother, recognizing the increased demands on your small body, saves tiny portions of her own food to add to your meager breakfast. The gesture is made without comment, but you understand its significance in a world where every morsel of food represents precious calories needed for survival. Her sacrifice demonstrates a love that transcends words. The work itself takes on new complexities in winter. Cold makes the cotton threads more brittle, requiring even greater care and handling. Your fingers, already skilled from months of practice, must now work with increased precision to avoid breaking the fragile fibers. The spinning frames seem to run differently in the cold, their metal components contracting and expanding with temperature changes, creating new sounds and vibrations that require your constant attention. You develop a kind of intuitive understanding of your machine's moods and needs. On particularly cold mornings, frame number 47 requires extra oil to run smoothly, and you learn to recognize the subtle changes in its sound that indicate when the moving parts need additional lubrication. You become skilled at reading the machine's rhythm, understanding when it's running at optimal efficiency and when it's struggling with the effects of temperature or humidity changes. The relationship between worker and machine in the industrial age is unlike anything that has existed before in human history. Unlike the tools of agricultural life, which were extensions of human will and strength, the factory machine operates according to its own logic and requirements. You must adapt to its needs rather than in adapting to yours. The machine sets the pace, determines the rhythm of your day, and demands constant attention and care. In return, it provides the steady production that generates the wages that keep your family alive. This relationship creates a strange kind of intimacy between worker and machine. You spend more time with frame number 47 than with any human being, including your own family. You know its sounds, its temperament, its needs and demands. You can diagnose its problems by listening to subtle changes in its operation. And you take a kind of pride in keeping it running smoothly and efficiently. The machine becomes not just your tool, but in some sense, your partner in a daily struggle for survival. As winter progresses, begin to notice changes in your own body that extend beyond the expected effects of long hours and hard work. Your hands, once soft and small, have become tough and calloused. Your fingers quick and sure in their movements. Your hearing has adapted to the constant noise of the factory, allowing you to distinguish between different types of mechanical sounds and to carry on conversations despite the din. Your eyesight has become sharper, trained to spot broken threads and mechanical problems from a distance. But there are other changes that are less welcome. Your growth seems to have slowed, and you remain smaller than other children your age who don't work in the mills. Your appetite has decreased, not from lack of hunger, but from the constant inhalation of cotton fibers that seems to coat your throat and stomach. Your sleep is often restless, interrupted by coughing fits and dreams filled with the sound of spinning wheels and moving belts. The social dynamics of the mill create a unique community unlike anything that existed in pre-industrial society. Workers from different backgrounds, ages, and circumstances are brought together by the common experience of industrial labor. You work alongside former farm workers, displaced craftsmen, and urban poor, all united by the necessity of earning wages to survive. The shared hardship creates bonds that transcend traditional social divisions, and you find yourself forming friendships with people you would never have encountered in your previous life. Mary, the 8-year-old girl who works at the frame beside yours, becomes your closest companion in this new world. Her family came to Manchester from Ireland, driven by the potato famine that devastated their homeland. She speaks with a soft accent that reminds you of music, and she has a way of finding humor in even the most difficult situations. During the brief breaks in work, she tells you stories of her homeland, of green fields and stone walls, of a life that seems as distant, and mythical as the fairy tales your mother once told you. The friendship between you and Mary illustrates one of the unexpected consequences of industrialization. the creation of new forms of human connection that transcend traditional boundaries of nationality, religion, and social class. In the agricultural world, such a friendship would have been unlikely. The rigid social hierarchies of rural life kept people in their designated places, but in the democratic misery of the factory floor, such distinctions become meaningless. Suffering, it seems, is a universal language that creates its own forms of understanding and companionship. The overseers and factory managers occupy a different social stratum, representatives of the new industrial hierarchy that has replaced the old agricultural order. Mr. Hartwell, the overseer who supervises your section, is a man caught between two worlds. He understands the human cost of industrial production, having worked his way up from the factory floor, but he also serves the demands of efficiency and profit that drive the entire system. His job requires him to maintain a delicate balance between pushing workers to their limits and keeping them healthy enough to continue working. You learn to read the subtle signs of Mr. Hartwell's moods and concerns. When production quotas are not being met, his voice becomes sharper, his movements more agitated. When there have been accidents or injuries, he becomes more vigilant, watching for signs of fatigue or carelessness. He is not a cruel man, but he is a practical one, and his sympathy for the worker's plight is tempered by his understanding of the economic realities that govern the mill's operation. The winter months bring news from the outside world that filters into the factory through newspapers and conversations. There are reports of similar mills in other cities, of new technologies that promise to make production even more efficient, of political movements that speak of workers' rights and industrial reform. But these distant concerns seem abstract and irrelevant compared to the immediate challenges of staying warm, fed, and safe in the daily struggle of factory life. Christmas arrives with little fanfare in the industrial world. The factory closes for only one day, and the celebration is muted by the awareness that lost production means lost wages. Your family's Christmas dinner consists of a small piece of beef and some potatoes, a feast by your current standards, but a far cry from the elaborate celebrations of your childhood in the countryside. The gifts are practically a new pair of stockings from your mother, a small wooden toy that your younger brother has carved from scraps of wood. Yet there is something profound in this modest celebration, recognition that human dignity and family love persist even in the harsh environment of industrial life. The simple meal, shared in the warmth of your cramped room, becomes a moment of grace that transcends the material poverty of your circumstances. You realize that the bonds of family and community can survive even the most dramatic social transformations, adapting and finding new forms of expression in changed circumstances the new year brings. Subtle changes to the rhythm of factory life. You notice that your body has adapted more completely to the demands of industrial work, that the tasks that once seemed impossible now feel routine. Your hands move with automatic precision, your eyes scan the machinery with trained efficiency, and your mind has learned to maintain the state of relaxed alertness that factory work requires. You have become, in the space of a few months, a skilled industrial worker. Your childhood transformed into a specialized form of human capital. This transformation represents one of the most significant changes in human history, the conversion of agricultural laborers into industrial workers. The replacement of skills developed over generations with new forms of expertise designed for machine production. You are part of the first generation to grow up entirely within the industrial system. Your childhood shaped by the demands of factory production rather than the rhythms of rural life. The knowledge you are acquiring is entirely different from the wisdom passed down through generations of agricultural work. Instead of understanding seasons and weather, soil, and crops, you are learning the language of machines and industrial processes. Your education consists of practical skills: how to tie knots that will hold under mechanical tension, how to detect problems in machinery by sound and vibration, how to work safely around dangerous equipment. This new form of knowledge is both more specialized and more limited than the broad understanding of nature that characterized pre-industrial life as winter gives way to spring. The factory environment begins to change again. Windows can be opened for ventilation and fresh air begins to circulate through the spinning rooms. The improvement in air quality is immediately noticeable. The cotton fibers seem less oppressive. The oil vapors less concentrated. Your cough, which has persisted throughout the winter months, begins to ease, though it never disappears entirely. The seasonal cycle, so fundamental to agricultural life, still exerts its influence even in the industrial world, providing reminders of the natural rhythms that industrial society has tried to supersede. The longer days of spring bring their own challenges and benefits. The additional daylight means that the oil lamps can be extinguished earlier, reducing the heat and fumes in the factory. But it also means that the working day can be extended, as factory owners seek to maximize production during the favorable conditions. Your 14-hour days sometimes stretch to 15 or 16 hours, testing the limits of human endurance and highlighting the fundamental tension between human needs and industrial demands. Your 10th birthday passes without celebration, marked only by a small piece of cake that your mother has managed to obtain. The milestone feels both significant and meaningless significant because it represents another year of survival in the challenging world of industrial labor. Meaningless because the distinctions of childhood and adulthood seemed irrelevant in the context of factory work. You have been forced to mature beyond your years, to take on responsibilities and face dangers that would have been unimaginable in your previous life. As the spring progresses into summer, you begin to understand that your experience in the textile mill is part of a much larger transformation that is reshaping not just England, but the entire world. The threads you tie, the bobbins you tend, the cloth produced by your factory, all of these become part of a global network of trade and production that extends far beyond the grimy streets of Manchester. The cotton comes from plantations in America, worked by enslaved people whose lives are as constrained as your own, though in different ways. The finished textiles are shipped to markets around the world, connecting your small hands to economic systems that span continents. This understanding brings a new perspective to your daily work. Each thread you tie becomes part of a larger pattern. Each bobbin you tend contributes to a global transformation that is creating new forms of wealth and power. You are no longer simply a child trying to survive in difficult circumstances. You are a participant in one of the most significant changes in human history, a contributor to the Industrial Revolution that is reshaping civilization itself. Summer in the textile mill brings its own particular challenges. It's transforming the already demanding environment into something that tests the very limits of human endurance. It's the heat, which had provided welcome relief during the bitter winter months, now becomes an oppressive force that seems to press down upon every surface, every breath, every movement within the factory walls. The spinning frames, which generate their own heat through constant friction and mechanical operation, turn the mill floor into something resembling a furnace lined with cotton and populated by small, determined figures moving through the shimmering air like ghosts in a fever dream. Your body, now 11 months into this industrial life, has adapted in ways that would have seemed impossible during those first terrifying days. Your hands move with unconscious precision, your fingers reading the texture and tension of cotton threads with the sensitivity of a musician playing a familiar instrument. You have developed what the older workers call mill sense, an intuitive understanding of machinery that allows you to detect problems before they become serious, to anticipate the needs of your equipment, to work with dangerous moving parts while maintaining the kind of calm awareness that keeps you safe. The summer heat intensifies everything about the factory experience. The cotton fibers that float constantly through the air become more numerous and more oppressive, creating an atmosphere so thick that breathing becomes a conscious effort. The oil from the machinery seems to hang in the air like an invisible fog, coating your skin and clothes with a film that never quite disappears, no matter how thoroughly you wash. The combination of human perspiration, machine oil, cotton dust creates a unique aromatic environment that becomes so familiar you cease to notice it, though visitors to the mill often comment on the overwhelming intensity of the smell. Water becomes a precious commodity during these summer months. The mill owners provide large barrels of water for the workers, but the demand is so great that the supply often runs low by midday. You'll learn to ration your own consumption, taking small sips throughout the day rather than drinking deeply when thirsty. The water itself is often warm and has a metallic taste from the iron barrels, but it represents life and survival in the oppressive heat of the factory floor. Your relationship with Mary deepens during these challenging months. The shared ordeal of working in summer heat creates a bond that goes beyond mere friendship. You develop a system of silent communication that allows you to check on each other's welfare without alerting the overseers to any momentary weakness. A slight nod indicates that all is well. A particular gesture suggests the need for water. A certain look warns of an overseer's approach. This private language becomes essential to survival, creating a form of mutual protection that makes the isolated experience of factory work slightly more bearable. The summer also brings news of developments in other mills and factories throughout England. There are reports of workers in some facilities organizing to demand better conditions, shorter hours, and higher wages. These stories filter through the factory community like underground streams, passed from worker to worker in whispered conversations during the brief breaks when the machines fall silent. The idea that workers might have some power to influence their own conditions seems revolutionary and slightly unbelievable. Given the apparent omnipotence of the factory owners and their representatives, you begin to understand that your particular mill, Cromford Mill, represents just one small part of a vast network of industrial facilities that are transforming England into what some are beginning to call the workshop of the world. The textiles produced by your labor and that of your fellow workers are shipped not just to other parts of England, quote, but to markets across Europe, to the expanding territories of the British Empire, and even to the new nation of America. Your small hands, working with cotton threads in the heat and noise of Manchester, connected to economic forces that span continents and influence the lives of millions of people you will never meet. This global perspective brings both pride and a strange sense of alienation. On one hand, you're contributing to something magnificent and historically significant, the transformation of human civilization through industrial production. The cloth created by your mill may become clothing for people in distant lands, sails for ships exploring unknown waters, or furnishings for homes and cities you cannot imagine. Your work has meaning and consequence far beyond the immediate struggle for survival. On the other hand, its vast scope makes your individual experience seem small and insignificant. You are just one of hundreds of workers in your mill, which is just one of dozens of mills in Manchester, which is just one of many industrial cities in England. The forces that govern your life, the demand for textiles, the price of cotton, the decisions of distant factory owners, according to logic that has little to do with your personal needs, desires, or well-being. You are part of a system that is larger and more powerful than any individual, a system that uses human labor. It's one component among many in the pursuit of production and profit. The summer months also bring subtle changes in the social dynamics of the mill. The intense heat creates a kind of democratic misery that levels some of the usual distinctions between workers. Everyone suffers equally from the oppressive conditions, and this shared ordeal creates a sense of solidarity that transcends the usual divisions of age, background, and skill level. You notice that conversations between workers become more open, that complaints about conditions are expressed more freely, and that there is a growing sense that the current situation cannot continue indefinitely without some form of change or reform. Mr. Hartwell, the overseer, becomes increasingly concerned about the effects of the heat on worker productivity and safety. He institutes more frequent water breaks and allows workers to open windows during certain hours, despite the risk of cotton fibers being blown about by breezes. His pragmatic approach to management recognizes that pushing workers beyond their physical limits will ultimately result in decreased production and increased accidents. Yet, he remains constrained by the demands of his superiors. Hugh measures success primarily in terms of output and efficiency, rather than worker welfare. Accident rate does increase during the summer months. Fatigue and heat exhaustion take their toll on workers' concentration and reflexes. You witness several incidents that serve as stark reminders of the constant danger inherent in factory work. Sarah, a girl of 13 who works at a frame across the room, faints from the heat and falls against her machine, suffering cuts on her arms and face from the moving belts. James, a boy of 14, becomes dizzy while cleaning beneath the spinning frame and narrowly avoids being caught in the machinery. When other workers pull him to safety, these accidents create a complex, emotional environment in the mill. On one hand, they serve as constant reminders of your own vulnerability and the need for constant vigilance. On the other hand, they demonstrate the reality of mutual dependence among workers, the understanding that survival often depends on the watchfulness and quick action of your fellow laborers. The mill community develops its own informal systems of protection and support, with experienced workers taking responsibility for watching over newcomers and vulnerable individuals. Your own near miss comes during a particularly oppressive afternoon in July, when the temperature inside the mill reaches levels that make normal breathing difficult. You are working beneath frame number 47, tying a broken thread, when the combination of heat, humidity, and cotton-laden air causes you to become momentarily dizzy. For a few seconds, the world seems to spin around you, and you lose track of the dangerous moving parts that surround you. It is only Mary's sharp warning cry that alerts you to a moving belt that is about to catch your clothing. You roll away just in time, your heart pounding with the recognition of how close you came to serious injury or death. The incident serves as a profound reminder of the precarious nature of your existence. In the space of a few seconds, your life could have been permanently altered or ended entirely. The machinery that provides your livelihood is also a constant threat to your safety and survival. This dual nature of industrial technology's capacity to both provide and destroy is a central theme in your understanding of the new world you inhabit. The summer also brings changes in your physical development that reflect the long-term effects of factory work. Your shoulders have become broader and stronger from the constant reaching and lifting required by your job. Your hands have developed a particular kind of dexterity that allows you to work with fine threads and small machinery parts with remarkable precision. Your hearing has adapted to the constant noise of the factory, allowing you to distinguish between different types of mechanical sounds and to carry on conversations despite the din. But there are other changes that are less positive. Your growth seems to have slowed compared to children who don't work in mills. Your complexion has taken on the pale, slightly gray tone that characterizes long-term factory workers. Your cough, though not severe, has become a permanent feature of your daily life. These physical markers identify you as belonging to a particular social class and economic circumstance, creating visible distinctions that separate mill workers from other segments of society. The economic realities of your family's situation become clearer to you as the months pass. Your wages, though small, represent a significant portion of your family's total income. Without your contribution, your family would face genuine starvation and homelessness. This understanding brings both pride and pride in your ability to contribute to your family's survival, but also the heavy knowledge that your childhood has been sacrificed to economic necessity. You begin to understand the complex mathematics of poverty that govern working-class life in industrial England. Every expenditure must be carefully calculated against the family's total income. Food, rent, fuel, and clothing all compete for the limited resources provided by your wages and those of your mother, who takes in washing when her health permits. There is no margin for error, no cushion against unexpected expenses or loss of income. Illness, injury, or any interruption in work could quickly lead to disaster. This economic precariousness creates a psychological environment of constant low-level anxiety. You learn to live with the knowledge that your family's survival depends on your continued ability to work, regardless of how you feel or what you might prefer to do. The luxury of choice, of pursuing personal interests or desires, becomes meaningless in the context of such immediate and pressing economic necessity. The summer evenings provide brief respites from the intensity of factory life. After the long day's work, you sometimes sit outside your family's building, enjoying the slightly cooler air and watching the activity in the streets. These moments allow you to observe the larger community of which you are a part. Other mill workers returning from their shifts, street vendors selling simple foods, children too young for factory work playing in the narrow spaces between buildings. During these quiet moments, you sometimes reflect on the life you left behind in the countryside. The memories are still vivid. The feel of grass beneath your feet, the taste of fresh milk, the sound of birds singing in trees that weren't covered with soot. But these memories are beginning to feel like they belong to someone else, or perhaps to a character in a story you once heard. Your current life, with its mechanical rhythms and industrial challenges, has become your reality in such a complete way that your rural childhood seems almost mythical. The contrast between your past and present creates a unique perspective on the changes that are transforming English society. You are part of the first generation to experience the full impact of industrialization, to grow up entirely within the new economic and social systems that factory production has created. Your childhood represents a historical transition point, a bridge between the agricultural world that had existed for centuries and the industrial world that is rapidly replacing it. The knowledge and skills you are acquiring are entirely different from those that previous generations learned during their youth. Instead of understanding animals and crops, weather and seasons, you are learning the language of machines and industrial processes. Your education consists of practical knowledge about mechanical systems, safety procedures, and production techniques. This new form of learning is both more specialized and more limited than the broad understanding of natural systems that characterize pre-industrial life. As summer progresses toward autumn, you begin to anticipate the changing seasons with the mixed feelings of someone who has learned to see climate through the lens of industrial production. Cooler weather will bring relief from the oppressive heat, but it will also mean longer hours under artificial lighting, closed windows that trap cotton fibers and oil vapors, and the return of the respiratory problems that plagued you during the previous winter. The cyclical nature of factory life creates its own rhythm. It's different from, but somehow parallel to, the natural cycles that once governed human existence. Instead of planting and harvest, you experience the cycles of production quotas and machinery maintenance. Instead of seasonal festivals, you mark time by paydays and the rare factory holidays. The industrial calendar has replaced the agricultural calendar, creating new forms of temporal organization that serve the needs of mechanical production rather than biological necessity. Your first full year of factory work draws to a close with a mixture of exhaustion and achievement. You have survived the transition from rural to industrial life, adapted to working conditions that would have seemed impossible 12 months earlier. It's contributed to your family's economic survival during a period of dramatic social change. You have learned skills that make you valuable in the new industrial economy, and you have formed relationships that provide emotional support in an often harsh environment. Yet the cost of this adaptation has been enormous. Your childhood has been compressed into a few months of adjustment replaced by responsibilities and challenges that would test an adult. Your health has been compromised by working conditions that prioritize production over human welfare. Your education has been limited to the practical knowledge needed for factory work, excluding the broader learning that might have prepared you for other possibilities in life. As autumn approaches, and you prepare for your second winter in the mill, you understand that you have become something new in human history, an industrial worker, shaped by machines and mechanical processes, adapted to survive in an environment that previous generations could not have imagined. Your story is being repeated in factories across England, creating a new social class with its own culture, values, and ways of understanding the world. The transformation is far from complete. The Industrial Revolution is still in its early stages, and the social systems needed to support this new form of economic organization are still being developed. You are part of an experiment in human adaptation, a test of how far human beings can be pushed to accommodate the demands of mechanical production. The results of this experiment will shape not just your own life, but the lives of millions of people for generations to come. The story shifts now from the cotton mills of Manchester to the match factories of London's East End, where a different kind of industrial drama is about to unfold. In the summer of 1888, as you continue your work among the spinning frames, hundreds of miles away in the grimy streets of Bow, young women are preparing to make history in ways they could never have anticipated. Their struggle will illuminate the broader patterns of exploitation and resistance that characterize the industrial age, showing how ordinary people can challenge seemingly insurmountable systems of power. Imagine yourself walking through the narrow streets of Bow in the early morning hours of June 1888. The air is thick with the acrid smell of phosphorus and sulfur, chemical odors that seem to cling to every surface and penetrate every breath. The buildings lining these streets are blackened with soot and industrial grime, their windows often broken or boarded up, their doorways crowded with families who have nowhere else to go. This is one of London's poorest neighborhoods, home to immigrants, casual laborers, and the thousands of workers who keep the city's industries running. At the heart of this industrial landscape stands the Bryant and May Match Factory, massive brick structure that employs over 1,400 workers, most of them young women and girls between the ages of 13 and 25. The factory produces millions of matches each day, feeding the growing demand for convenient fire-starting materials in an age when gas lighting and coal heating make matches essential household items. The building dominates the surrounding neighborhood like a fortress of industry, its tall chimneys belching yellow smoke that carries the distinctive smell of phosphorus chemistry. Inside the factory, the work environment presents challenges that are different from but equally demanding as those found in textile mills. The matchmaking process requires workers to handle dangerous chemicals, work with precision machinery, and maintain productivity levels that push human endurance to its limits. The air is constantly filled with phosphorus vapors, sulfur compounds, and wood dust from the matchsticks, creating an atmospheric cocktail that attacks workers' respiratory systems and nervous systems with relentless efficiency. Sarah Chapman is 14 years old when she begins working at Bryant and May in the spring of 1888. Her family came to London from rural Essex, driven by agricultural depression that made farming unsustainable for small landowners. Like thousands of other rural families, they arrived in London with little money, no connections, few skills that translated directly to urban industrial work. Sarah's father found occasional employment as a dock worker, but the irregular nature of such work meant that the family's survival depended on additional income from whatever sources they could find. The match factory offered one of the few employment opportunities available to young women with no specialized training. The work required manual dexterity, attention to detail, and the ability to withstand difficult working conditions. But it didn't require literacy or previous industrial experience. For families like Sarah's, desperate for any source of regular income, this factory represented both salvation and a kind of purgatory, a place where survival was possible. But at a cost that seemed to compound with every passing day. Sarah's workday begins at 6:30 in the morning and continues until 6 o'clock in the evening, with brief breaks for meals that workers must take at their stations. The factory floor is organized into different sections, each handling a specific part of the matchmaking process. Sarah works in the dipping room, where wooden matchsticks are coated with a chemical mixture that includes white phosphorus, sulfur, and various binding agents. The work requires her to handle thousands of matches each day, dipping them in chemical solutions and arranging them on trays for drying. The white phosphorus used in match production is known to be dangerous, but the full extent of its health effects is not yet understood by the workers who handle it daily. The chemical causes a condition called phossy jaw. It's progressive decay of the jawbone that begins with toothaches and swelling, and eventually leads to the literal dissolution of bone tissue. Workers afflicted with this condition experience excruciating pain, disfigurement, and often death. The company's medical officer dismisses most complaints as malingering or poor hygiene, and workers who develop symptoms are often dismissed rather than treated. The physical environment of the dipping room is challenging in ways that extend beyond the chemical hazards. The work requires workers to stand for 11.5 hours each day, with only brief periods of sitting during meal breaks. The repetitive motions of dipping matches and arranging them on trays create strain on workers' hands, wrists, and shoulders that builds up over months and years of employment. The chemical vapors in the air cause eye irritation, respiratory problems, skin reactions that become worse with prolonged exposure. Sarah quickly learns to recognize the signs of phosphorus poisoning in herself and her fellow workers. The first symptoms are often subtle metallic taste in the mouth, slight swelling of the gums, increased sensitivity of teeth. But as exposure continues, the symptoms become more serious. Workers develop persistent coughs, experience weakness, and fatigue that goes beyond normal tiredness, and began to show the telltale signs of jaw deterioration that mark the onset of phossy jaw. The social dynamics of the match factory reflect the broader patterns of industrial exploitation that characterize late 19th century capitalism. The workers are almost entirely young women from poor families, chosen specifically because they are seen as more docile and manageable than male workers. They have few alternative employment opportunities and little bargaining power with management. The factory owners use this vulnerability to maintain working conditions and wages that would be unacceptable to workers with more options. The wages paid to match workers are deliberately kept at subsistence levels, just enough to prevent workers from starving, but not enough to allow them to accumulate savings or seek alternative employment. Sarah earns approximately 4 shillings per week, which must cover her contribution to family rent, food, and clothing. After these basic expenses, there is virtually nothing left for medical care, education, or any of the small pleasures that might make life bearable. The economic trap is carefully designed to keep workers dependent on their employment while providing maximum profit to the factory owners. The management structure of the factory creates additional layers of exploitation and control. For women, typically older workers who have survived long enough to gain some seniority are given small amounts of additional authority and pay in exchange for monitoring and controlling other workers. This system creates divisions among the workers, making collective action more difficult while ensuring that management always has eyes and ears on the factory floor. The 4 women are caught in an impossible position. They understand the workers' grievances, but depend on management's favor for their own survival. The fining system represents one of the most insidious aspects of factory control. Workers are fined for a long list of infractions that include arriving late, talking during work hours, having dirty hands, dropping matches, or working too slowly. The fines are deducted directly from workers' already meager wages, and the list of offenses is comprehensive enough that virtually any worker can be fined at any time for some violation. This system serves multiple purposes. It provides additional revenue for the company, creates a mechanism for controlling worker behavior, and ensures that actual wages paid are even lower than the already inadequate nominal wages Sarah experiences. The fining system firsthand during her second week of employment. She arrives at work 2 minutes late due to a delay in the omnibus service and discovers that she has been docked half a day's pay for tardiness. When she attempts to explain the circumstances, she is threatened with additional fines for insubordination and disrupting work discipline. The incident teaches her that the factory operates according to rules that are designed to favor management at every turn, and that workers have virtually no recourse against arbitrary punishment. The health effects of match production become increasingly apparent to Sarah as the weeks pass. She develops a persistent cough that seems to worsen each day, and she notices that her gums have begun to swell and bleed. Other workers show more advanced symptoms. Mary Driscoll, who has worked in the factory for 3 years, has lost several teeth and suffers from constant pain in her jaw. Annie Besant, though not a worker herself, has begun visiting the factory to document the health effects of phosphorus exposure, and her presence creates both hope and anxiety among the workers. Annie Besant is a journalist and social reformer who has taken an interest in the conditions at Bryant and T. May as part of her broader investigation into industrial working conditions. Her background is middle class, and her perspective is that of an educated outsider looking into the world of industrial labor. But her commitment to documenting and publicizing the workers' plight represents a new form of alliance between middle-class reformers and working-class activists that will become increasingly important in the struggle for labor rights. Besant's initial articles about the match factory focus on the health hazards of phosphorus exposure and the economic exploitation of young women workers. She documents cases of phossy jaw, describes the fining system, and calculates the actual wages workers receive after deductions. Her writing brings public attention to conditions that the factory owners have tried to keep hidden, and it begins to build support for the workers among middle-class readers who had been unaware of the realities of industrial labor. The workers themselves are initially suspicious of Besant's interest in their situation. Their experience has taught them to be wary of middle-class people who claim to want to help, as such assistance often comes with conditions and expectations that working-class people find difficult to meet. But Besant's persistence in documenting their stories and her willingness to criticize powerful business interests gradually wins the trust of workers like Sarah, who are desperate for any form of support in their struggle against factory conditions. The crisis that leads to the strike begins with the dismissal of a worker who refuses to sign a statement denying the accuracy of Besant's articles. The management demands that all workers sign a document stating that they are satisfied with their working conditions and that reports of health problems and exploitation are false. Most workers, fearful of losing their jobs, reluctantly agree to sign. But when one worker refuses, she is immediately dismissed, and her dismissal becomes a catalyst for collective action. The dismissed worker's name is lost to history, but her courage in refusing to lie about her working conditions inspires other workers to reconsider their own relationship with factory management. Sarah finds herself part of a group of workers who begin meeting secretly to discuss their options. The conversations are conducted in whispers during brief breaks, in coded language that won't attract the attention of 4 women, and in the workers' homes after the long factory day has ended. The decision to strike is not made lightly. The workers understand that they are risking not just their jobs, but their families' survival. In an economy where unemployment means immediate destitution, the choice to refuse work requires courage that goes beyond personal bravery. It represents a collective decision to prioritize dignity and justice over immediate economic security, a decision that few groups of workers had been willing to make in the industrial age. The strike begins on July 5, 1888, when approximately 700 workers, led by Sarah Chapman and other young women, walk out of the Bryant and May factory. The action is spontaneous and unorganized, driven by anger and desperation rather than careful planning. The workers have no strike fund, no union backing, and no clear strategy for achieving their goals. They have only their collective refusal to continue working under unacceptable conditions and their faith that their cause is just. The sight of 700 young women marching through the streets of Bow creates a sensation that extends far beyond the immediate neighborhood. Strike actions by organized male workers are not uncommon, but collective action by young women represents something new and unprecedented in British industrial relations. The workers carry improvised banners demanding better wages, improved working conditions, and an end to the arbitrary fining system. Their chants and songs echo through streets that have rarely heard the sound of organized protest. The immediate response from factory management is predictable threats of permanent dismissal. Claims that the workers are being manipulated by outside agitators and attempts to recruit replacement workers from the large pool of unemployed people in East London. The company's management assumes that the strike will collapse within a few days as workers are forced by economic necessity to return to work on management's terms. They underestimate both the workers' determination and the level of public support that the strike would generate. The second week of the strike brings both challenges and revelations that test the resolve of the match workers and reshape their understanding of their own power. Sarah Chapman finds herself at the center of negotiations that will determine not only the immediate outcome of the strike, but also the broader question of whether working-class women can successfully challenge industrial authority. The days are filled with meetings, demonstrations, and the constant anxiety of families living without regular income. But they are also marked by moments of solidarity and discovery that transform the participants' sense of their own possibilities. Factory owners, led by Frances May and William Bryant, initially respond to the strike with a combination of threats and attempts to divide the workers. They offer individual deals to some strikers, promising better treatment and slight wage increases to those who return to work immediately. They also begin recruiting replacement workers from other parts of London, advertising the positions as offering excellent opportunities for reliable young women. The strategy is designed to create pressure on the strikers by demonstrating that they can be replaced, while also appealing to the economic desperation of unemployed women who might be willing to cross picket lines for any chance of employment. Sarah and the other strike leaders recognize that these tactics represent the most serious threat to their action. If enough workers return to their jobs, or if enough replacement workers can be found, the strike will lose its effectiveness and the remaining workers will be forced to return on management's terms. The challenge is to maintain solidarity among the strikers while also preventing the recruitment of replacement workers, a task that requires both organizational skill and careful attention to the economic pressures facing working-class families throughout East London. The picketing that develops around the Bryant and May factory represents one of the most visible aspects of the strike action. Groups of workers, led by figures like Sarah Chapman, position themselves at the factory gates to discourage replacement workers and to maintain the visibility of their cause. The picketing is conducted with remarkable discipline and restraint, avoiding the violence that might have provided authorities with justification for forcible intervention. The striking workers understand that their cause depends on maintaining public sympathy, and that any incidents of disorder could undermine the support they have worked so hard to build. The interactions between strikers and potential replacement workers create some of the most poignant moments of the entire action. Many of the women who come seeking work are themselves desperate for employment. facing the same economic pressures that drive the strikers to maintain their jobs despite dangerous conditions. Sarah finds herself in conversations with unemployed women who explain that they have children to feed and rent to pay, that they cannot afford the luxury of solidarity when their families are facing immediate starvation. These encounters force Sarah and the other strikers to confront the complex realities of working-class life, where individual survival often conflicts with collective action. The women who might take their jobs are not enemies or villains, but fellow victims of an economic system that creates artificial scarcity and forces working people to compete against each other for insufficient resources. The challenge becomes finding ways to build solidarity across these divisions, to create forms of mutual support that can sustain both the strikers and the unemployed women who might otherwise undermine their action. Annie Besant's role evolves during this phase of the strike from journalist and publicist to active organizer and strategist. Her middle-class background provides her with access to resources and connections that the workers lack. But her growing involvement also creates tensions within the strike leadership. Some workers question whether they can trust someone whose class position insulates her from the economic pressures they face, while others appreciate the practical assistance she provides in dealing with media, legal issues, and fundraising. The tension between working-class leadership and middle-class support reflects broader questions about the relationship between different social classes and the struggle for industrial reform. Besant's contributions are undeniably valuable. Her writing skills, her connections with sympathetic newspapers, and her ability to raise funds from middle-class donors all strengthen the strike. But her involvement also raises questions about who controls the direction of the movement and whose interests are ultimately being served. Sarah Chapman emerges as a crucial figure in navigating these class tensions. Her authenticity as a working-class woman gives her credibility with the strikers, while her intelligence and communication skills make her an effective spokesperson for the movement. She learns to work with middle-class supporters like Besant, while maintaining the independence and working-class identity of the strike. Her leadership represents a new model of labor activism that combines working-class militancy with strategic alliances across class lines. The resolution of the Match Girl strike comes not through dramatic confrontation, but through the patient accumulation of pressure and a gradual recognition by both sides that compromise serves their long-term interests better than continued conflict. The final negotiations take place in a series of meetings held at the offices of sympathetic middle-class organizations, creating neutral ground where workers and management can meet as approximate equals, rather than in the hierarchical setting of the factory. Sarah Chapman finds herself sitting across a polished wooden table from Francis May himself, translating the grievances of hundreds of workers into language that factory owners can understand and accept. The agreement, reached on July 16, 1888, represents a remarkable victory for the striking workers, though like most negotiated settlements, it falls short of everything they had hoped to achieve. The company agrees to end the most arbitrary aspects of the fining system, provide modest wage increases, improve ventilation in the workrooms, and recognize the workers' right to form committees to address future grievances. Most significantly, Bryant and May commit to gradually replacing white phosphorus with safer alternatives, though this transition will take place over several years rather than immediately. For Sarah Chapman and her fellow workers, these concessions represent validation of their courage in challenging seemingly insurmountable authority. The fining system that had stolen pennies from their already meager wages will be reformed, though not entirely eliminated. The toxic phosphorus that has stolen their health will eventually be replaced, though many workers will continue to suffer from exposure they have already experienced. The wage increases will ease, but not eliminate, the economic pressures that drive families to send their children into dangerous factory work. The return to work on July 17th is marked by a mixture of celebration and apprehension. The striking workers marched back into the Bryant and May factory carrying banners that proclaimed their victory, but they also carried the knowledge that they must now work alongside management representatives who opposed their action and may harbor resentment about the concessions they were forced to make. The transformation of workplace relationships from open conflict to negotiated cooperation proves to be as challenging as the strike itself. Sarah discovers that her role as a strike leader has permanently changed her position within the factory hierarchy. Management views her with a mixture of wariness and grudging respect, recognizing that she represents a potential source of future organizing efforts while acknowledging that her influence among workers makes her too valuable to simply dismiss. Her fellow workers also see her differently, no longer just another match girl struggling for survival, but a proven leader who has demonstrated the possibility of successful resistance to industrial authority. The immediate aftermath of the strike reveals both the achievements and limitations of working-class collective action in the late Victorian period. The specific improvements won by the match workers are real and significant, providing immediate relief from some of the most oppressive aspects of factory life. But the broader system of industrial capitalism that creates the need for such struggles remains unchanged. And workers in other factories continue to face similar challenges without the benefit of the publicity and middle-class support that made the match girls' victory possible. The health problems caused by years of phosphorus exposure cannot be immediately reversed by workplace reforms. Mary Driscoll, whose advanced case of phossy jaw made her one of the most compelling witnesses to the dangers of match production, continues to deteriorate despite the strike's success. Her condition serves as a constant reminder of the human costs of industrial production and the limitations of reforms that come only after workers have already paid with their health and lives. The gradual transition away from white phosphorus proves to be more complex and slower than the striking workers had hoped. The company's commitment to finding safer alternatives is genuine, but the technical challenges of replacing a chemical that has been central to match production for decades require extensive research and experimentation. Meanwhile, workers continue to handle dangerous materials, though improved ventilation and safety procedures reduce their exposures somewhat. Sarah Chapman's personal transformation during and after the strike reflects the broader changes experienced by many participants in the action. The shy, frightened girl who began working at Bryant in May just months earlier has become a confident public speaker capable of articulating complex arguments about workers' rights and industrial safety. Her development represents the educational potential of collective action. The way that struggles for immediate improvements can also build the skills and consciousness needed for broader social change. The strike's success inspires similar actions by workers in other industries and other cities throughout Britain. Dock workers, who had been watching the match girls struggle with interest, launched their own strike action in 1889, applying lessons learned from the match workers' experience. Textile workers, gas workers, and employees in various other industries begin organizing unions and demanding improvements in their working conditions. The match girl strike becomes a catalyst for a broader wave of labor activism that historians later call the New Unionism. The role of women in this emerging labor movement is shaped significantly by the example of the match workers. The success of young working-class women in challenging, powerful employers demonstrates that effective labor organizing does not depend on traditional masculine virtues, with physical strength or aggressive confrontation. The match girls show that solidarity, persistence, and moral argument can be as powerful as any other weapons in the struggle for workers' rights. Annie Besant's continued involvement with the match workers after the strike reveals both the possibilities and tensions inherent in cross-class alliances within the labor movement. Her middle-class perspective and resources continue to be valuable to the workers, but her priorities and methods sometimes conflict with those of the working-class activists. she supports. The relationship requires constant negotiation and mutual adjustment, creating a model for cooperation that influences later collaborations between middle-class reformers and working-class organizers. The formation of the Matchmakers Union in the months following the strike represents an attempt to institutionalize the solidarity and collective power that emerged during the action. Sarah Chapman becomes one of the union's first officers, earning the skills needed to manage membership, collect dues, and negotiate with employers on an ongoing basis. The union provides a mechanism for addressing workplace problems before they escalate into strike situations, while also maintaining the capacity for collective action when necessary. The challenges faced by the new union reflect the broader difficulties of sustaining working-class organization in an economy that provides workers with little security or stability. Membership fluctuates as workers lose their jobs or move to other employment, and the union struggles to maintain financial stability when its members have so little disposable income. The organizers must balance the need to address immediate workplace problems with the longer-term goal of building a permanent institution capable of representing workers' interests over time. The cultural legacy of the Match Girl strike extends far beyond its immediate impact on labor relations. The image of young working-class women successfully challenging powerful employers enters popular culture through songs, stories, and theatrical productions that celebrate their courage and determination. These cultural representations help establish a tradition of working-class heroism that inspires future generations of labor activists. The strike also influences middle-class understanding of working-class life and capabilities. The intelligence, organization, and moral clarity demonstrated by the match workers' challenge. Stereotypes about the ignorance and passivity of poor people that have been used to justify economic inequality. Middle-class observers are forced to reconsider their assumptions about class differences and to acknowledge that working-class people are capable of sophisticated political action. The international impact of the Match Girls strike reflects the growing interconnectedness of labor movements across national boundaries. Reports of the action appear in newspapers throughout Europe and North America, inspiring similar organizing efforts and contributing to the development of international labor solidarity. The specific methods used by the match workers' publicity campaigns, alliance building with middle-class supporters, disciplined collective action, become models for labor activists in other countries facing similar challenges. The long-term health consequences of match production continue to affect workers for years after the strike's conclusion. Even with improved safety measures and the gradual transition away from white phosphorus, many workers suffer from permanent damage caused by earlier exposure. The company's limited compensation for occupational injuries means that workers like Mary Driscoll face ongoing medical expenses and lost earning capacity with little support from their former employer. The economic changes brought about by the strike proved to be sustainable over time, though their impact is limited by the broader context of industrial capitalism. The wage increases won by the workers provide some relief from immediate economic pressures, but they do not fundamentally alter the relationship between labor and capital that makes such struggles necessary. Workers continue to depend on their employment for survival, while owners continue to profit from their labor. Sarah Chapman's career after the strike illustrates both the opportunities and constraints facing working class women who demonstrate leadership capabilities. Her prominence during the strike action makes her a valuable spokesperson for labor causes, leading to speaking engagements and organizing opportunities beyond the match factory. But her gender and class background limit her access to formal political institutions and professional opportunities that might be available to middle-class men with similar skills. From the smoke-filled streets of London's match factories, our journey through industrial history now carries us northward to Manchester, where the very water itself tells a story of transformation more profound and disturbing than anything witnessed in the factory halls. Here, in the heart of England's Industrial Revolution, The River Irwell and its tributaries have become something entirely new in human experience. Waterways so saturated with chemical waste that they occasionally catch fire, flowing streams that glow with unnatural colors, and liquid pathways that carry death as readily as they once carried life. Imagine yourself standing on the banks of the River Irwell in the autumn of 1889. Just as the Match Girls' victory in London is inspiring workers across Britain to demand better conditions, the scene before you would challenge every assumption about what a river should be. Instead of the clear, flowing water that has sustained human civilization for millennia, witness a slow-moving stream of liquid that resembles nothing so much as an industrial soup, thick with suspended particles, colored by chemical dyes, and emitting vapors that burn your throat and make your eyes water. The transformation of Manchester's waterways represents one of the most dramatic environmental consequences of rapid industrialization, a change so complete that it defies the imagination of people who have never witnessed industrial pollution on such a scale. The River Irwell once supported salmon runs and provided clean drinking water for the communities along its banks. It's become a conduit for industrial waste so toxic that its very presence in the landscape creates health hazards for miles. Downstream, Dr. Edward Franklin stands at the forefront of a new kind of scientific investigation in 1889. One that seeks to understand and document the chemical transformation of natural systems by industrial processes. As one of Britain's leading chemists and the chief scientific advisor to the government on water quality issues, Franklin represents a generation of scientists who are beginning to comprehend the true scope of environmental damage caused by unchecked industrial development. His work in Manchester will reveal connections between water pollution and public health that challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between industrial progress and human welfare. Franklin's initial surveys of the Irwell system in 1889 reveal contamination levels that exceed anything previously documented in scientific literature. Water samples taken from various points along the river contain concentrations of heavy metals, organic compounds, and industrial chemicals that would be considered dangerous even by modern standards. The diversity of pollutants reflects the range of industries that have established themselves along the river's banks. Textile mills contributing dyes and bleaching agents, chemical works adding acids and alkalis, metalworking facilities releasing lead and mercury, and tanneries contributing organic waste products that consume the water's oxygen and create anaerobic conditions. The scientific methods available to Franklin in 1889 are primitive compared to modern analytical techniques, but they are sufficient to reveal the basic chemical composition of the polluted water and to establish clear connections between specific industrial processes and particular types of contamination, using relatively simple tests for acidity, heavy metal content, and organic matter. Franklin and his assistants create the first comprehensive chemical portrait of an industrially polluted river system. The visual evidence of pollution is even more dramatic than the chemical data. The river changes color daily depending on which industries are operating and what materials they are discharging. On Mondays, when textile mills begin their weekly production cycles, the water often runs deep red or blue from dye waste. Tuesdays might bring a yellow or green tint from chemical works, while Wednesdays could see the water turn black from coal, tar, and other organic compounds. The chromatic variations create a macabre calendar of industrial activity, visible proof of the direct connection between factory production and environmental degradation. The most spectacular manifestation of the river's contamination occurs during periods of low water flow, when concentrated chemical waste creates conditions that allow the water surface to ignite. These fires, first documented by Franklin in the summer of 1889, represent a phenomenon entirely without precedent in natural history. Rivers simply do not burn under normal circumstances, but the Irwell's extraordinary chemical composition creates conditions where floating oils and organic compounds can sustain combustion for hours at a time. The river fires attract crowds of spectators who gather on bridges and riverbanks to witness this supernatural spectacle. The flames dance across the water surface in patterns that seem to follow the flow of chemical currents, creating an otherworldly display that combines the terrible beauty of fire with the alien strangeness of industrially transformed nature. For many observers, these burning waters represent the most visible symbol of humanity's power to alter the fundamental character of the natural world. But the fires also serve as a stark reminder of the violence that industrial processes inflict on natural systems. The same chemical compounds that create such dramatic visual effects also destroy aquatic life, contaminate drinking water supplies, and create health hazards for human communities throughout the river valley. The beauty of burning water cannot disguise the fact that the river has essentially died, transformed from a living ecosystem into a chemical transport system that serves industrial needs while destroying everything else that once depended on its waters. Franklin's investigation of the pollution sources reveals the complex web of industrial relationships that has transformed the Irwell Valley into one of the most contaminated landscapes in human history. The river serves multiple functions for the industries that line its banks, as a source of water for production processes, as a convenient disposal system for waste products, and as a transportation route for raw materials and finished goods. This multiple use creates a feedback loop where pollution from upstream industries affects the operations of downstream facilities, leading to increasingly complex chemical interactions and compounding environmental damage. The textile mills represent the largest single source of pollution, discharging millions of gallons of contaminated water each day. The dyeing and finishing processes used to create the colorful fabrics that have made Manchester famous worldwide require vast quantities of water mixed with synthetic dyes, bleaching agents, and chemical fixatives. These substances are designed to be permanent and stable, qualities that make them valuable for textile production, but also ensure they persist in the environment long after they have served their industrial purpose. The chemical works that have proliferated along the river to serve the textile industry add their own forms of contamination to the aquatic environment. Sulfuric acid, sodium hydroxide, chlorine compounds, and various organic solvents enter the water system through direct discharge and accidental spills. These substances create chemical reactions with other pollutants already present in the water, generating new compounds that may be even more toxic than the original waste products. The metalworking facilities contribute heavy metals that accumulate in river sediments and bioaccumulate in any remaining aquatic organisms. Lead from paint and battery manufacturing, mercury from chemical processes, TAs, and various other toxic metals create a persistent contamination problem that will affect the river system for decades, even after the pollution sources are controlled. These metals represent some of the most dangerous contaminants because of their tendency to concentrate in living tissues and their potential for causing permanent neurological damage. The impact of this comprehensive pollution on human health becomes increasingly apparent as Franklin's investigation proceeds. Communities that depend on the river for drinking water experience elevated rates of waterborne diseases, including cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. But the health effects extend beyond infectious diseases to include chronic conditions that appear to be linked to chemical contamination. Residents of riverside neighborhoods report unusually high rates of respiratory problems, skin conditions, and neurological symptoms that cannot be explained by traditional disease patterns. The children living in these polluted communities bear a disproportionate burden of health effects from industrial contamination. Their developing nervous systems are particularly vulnerable to heavy metal poisoning, while their smaller body size means that they experience higher concentrations of toxic substances relative to their body weight. Franklin documents cases of children suffering from symptoms consistent with lead poisoning, mercury exposure, and chronic chemical irritation that appear to be directly related to their proximity to polluted water sources. The economic calculations that drive continued pollution revealed the fundamental conflict between short-term industrial profits and long-term environmental and human health. Factory owners understand that their waste disposal practices are causing environmental damage, but the immediate costs of implementing cleaner production methods or waste treatment systems exceed the economic benefits that individual companies can capture. The environmental costs are externalized to the broader community, while the profits from production accrue to private owners. This economic logic creates a tragedy of the commons, where rational individual decisions lead to collective disaster. Each factory owner has strong incentives to minimize their own production costs by discharging waste into the river. But the cumulative effect of these individual decisions is the destruction of a shared resource that ultimately harms everyone. The pollution problem cannot be solved by voluntary action because companies that invest in cleaner production methods will be at a competitive disadvantage compared to those that continue to externalize their environmental costs. Modern archaeological and forensic science has revealed secrets hidden for more than a century beneath the industrial cities of Victorian England. Secrets written in the very bones and teeth of people who lived and died in the shadow of the great factories through techniques that Dr. Franklin could never have imagined in 1889. Contemporary researchers have learned to read the chemical signatures preserved in human remains, turning graveyards into libraries of industrial toxicity and transforming individual skeletons into witnesses to collective environmental catastrophe. Dr. Janet Montgomery stands in the basement laboratory of Durham University in 2019, carefully examining a small fragment of tooth enamel that was removed from the skull of a child. Buried in Manchester's Ardwick Cemetery in 1894, the enamel appears unremarkable to the untrained ear-lod with age, slightly chipped, bearing the normal wear patterns of a 10-year-old who lived briefly in the industrial heart of Victorian England, but under the sophisticated analytical instruments available to modern science. This tiny fragment tells a story of environmental exposure that reveals the true human cost of rapid industrialization. The isotopic analysis of the tooth enamel shows lead concentrations that are more than 50 times higher than those found in children from rural areas during the same historical period. The lead signature is distinctive, matching the chemical fingerprint of industrial emissions from the lead smelting and chemical works that operated along the banks of the River Irwell during the 1880s and 1890s. The child whose tooth this was breathed air and drank water is contaminated with industrial pollutants that every day of their brief life was spent absorbing toxins that would have slowly damaged their developing nervous system. The scientific techniques that make such revelations possible were developed primarily for studying ancient populations and prehistoric diets, but they have found unexpected application in documenting the environmental health effects of historical industrial development. Isotope ratio mass spectrometry can identify the geographic origin of elements found in human bone and tooth enamel, while X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy reveals the concentrations of heavy metals that accumulated in tissues during life. These methods turn archaeological remains into environmental monitoring stations that provide data about historical pollution levels with a precision that would have been impossible for contemporary observers to achieve. The research conducted by Montgomery and her colleagues at Durham University represents part of a broader international effort to understand how industrial pollution affected human populations during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Similar studies in Germany, France, Belgium, Italy, and the United States have revealed patterns of environmental contamination and health effects that were largely invisible to contemporary medical knowledge, but can now be documented with scientific precision that exceeds anything available to historical investigators. The bone chemistry of adults who lived in Manchester during the height of industrial development reveals exposure to a complex mixture of toxic substances that reflects the chemical complexity of Victorian industrial processes. Lead levels are consistently elevated compared to pre-industrial populations, but the specific isotopic signatures of the lead indicate multiple exposure sources, including leaded paint, contaminated water supplies, and atmospheric deposition from industrial emissions. Mercury concentrations suggest exposure to chemical processes used in textile production and hat making, while elevated levels of arsenic appear to be linked to the use of arsenic-based dyes and pesticides. The children's remains tell an even more disturbing story. Tooth enamel forms during early childhood and preserves a permanent record of environmental conditions during the first few years of life. Children buried in Manchester's industrial districts showed evidence of massive toxic exposure beginning in infancy, with contaminant levels that would trigger immediate medical intervention and environmental cleanup efforts if discovered in modern populations. The chemical signatures preserved in their teeth revealed that these children were essentially living in the middle of what would now be classified as a major environmental disaster zone. The seasonal variations in contaminant exposure can be detected through analysis of tooth enamel growth rings, which form in patterns similar to tree rings and preserve information about environmental conditions. During different periods of childhood development, children who lived near the textile mills show higher concentrations of dye-related chemicals during winter months. When reduced air circulation allowed atmospheric pollutants to accumulate in industrial neighborhoods, summer months show elevated levels of different contaminants, reflecting changes in industrial production schedules and atmospheric conditions that affected the distribution of airborne toxins. The gender differences in contaminant exposure reflect the gendered nature of industrial labor and domestic responsibilities during the Victorian period. Women and girls often show higher levels of exposure to certain chemicals used in textile production, reflecting their predominant employment in mills and factories where such substances were used. But they also show evidence of exposure to domestic contaminants, including lead from paint and pottery glazes, while men and boys show elevated levels of metals associated with heavy industrial work and mining operations. The geographic distribution of contamination within Manchester can be mapped through analysis of remains from different cemeteries and burial grounds throughout the city. The highest levels of industrial contaminants are found in individuals buried in graveyards near the major industrial sites, while those buried in more distant locations show correspondingly lower, but still elevated levels of toxic exposure. The contamination gradients reveal how industrial pollution created zones of environmental hazard that extended for miles around the major production centers. The most recent advances in environmental archaeology have revealed that the contamination documented in Manchester extends far beyond individual human remains to encompass entire landscapes that preserve chemical signatures of industrial activity in sediment cores, tree rings, and even the crystalline structure of buildings and monuments. These environmental archives tell a story that spans not just individual lifetimes, but geological timescales, revealing how a few decades of intensive industrial activity created environmental changes that will persist for millennia. Dr. Sarah Roberts of the British Geological Survey stands beside the muddy banks of the River Irwell in 2021, supervising the extraction of sediment cores that will provide a year-by-year record of industrial contamination spanning more than 2 centuries. The drilling equipment penetrates deep into the riverbed, bringing up cylindrical sections of sediment that preserve environmental conditions, layer by layer, like pages in a book written by industrial chemistry rather than human language. Each centimeter of sediment represents approximately 1 year of deposition, creating a detailed chronological record of how the river's chemistry changed as Manchester's industrial development intensified. The laboratory analysis of these sediment cores reveals contamination patterns that correspond precisely with historical records of industrial development. The deepest layers, representing conditions before 1750, show background levels of heavy metals and organic compounds that are consistent with natural geological processes. But beginning in the 1760s, chemical composition of the sediments begins to change dramatically, with sharp increases in lead, mercury, copper, and a host of organic compounds that have no natural source. The period from 1800 to 1850 shows exponential increases in contamination levels that correspond with the explosive growth of Manchester's textile industry. Lead concentrations increase by more than 100-fold compared to pre-industrial levels, while mercury levels rise even more dramatically as chemical processes for textile finishing become widespread. New categories of contamination appear during this period, including complex organic compounds derived from coal tar, and synthetic dyes that did not exist in nature before human industrial activity created them. The most severe contamination occurs during the period from 1850 to 1900, when Manchester's industrial development reached its peak intensity. Sediment layers from this era contain concentrations of toxic substances that exceed modern environmental protection standards by orders of magnitude. The chemical diversity is staggering. More than 200 different industrial compounds have been identified in sediments from this period, representing a complex mixture of textile chemicals, metalworking byproducts, coal combustion residues, and organic solvents that created environmental conditions unlike anything in the planet's previous history. The tree ring analysis conducted by Dr. Roberts and her colleagues provides complementary evidence of atmospheric contamination that affected vegetation throughout the Manchester region. Ancient oak trees in nearby Tatton Park preserve chemical signatures in their annual growth rings that document changes in air quality from the 1600s to the present. The trees show dramatic increases in heavy metal uptake beginning in the early 1800s, with the peak contamination levels occurring during the 1880s and 1890s when industrial emissions reached their maximum intensity. The chemical analysis of tree rings reveals that atmospheric contamination extended far beyond the immediate industrial areas to affect rural landscapes dozens of miles from the nearest factories. Lead concentrations in tree rings from Tatton Park, located more than 20 miles from central Manchester, show significant elevation during the peak industrial period, demonstrating that airborne pollutants were distributed widely across the regional landscape. The contamination patterns suggest that atmospheric transport carried industrial emissions throughout much of northwestern England, creating regional environmental effects that affected ecosystems far from the pollution sources. The isotopic signatures of lead found in tree rings allow researchers to identify specific sources of atmospheric contamination with remarkable precision. The lead smelters operating in Manchester during the 19th century used ore from specific mines in Wales and Scotland, each with distinctive isotopic fingerprints that can be detected in environmental samples more than a century later. This chemical detective work reveals how industrial supply chains created environmental connections between distant geographic regions, as toxic materials mined in one location cause contamination in areas hundreds of miles away. The analysis of building materials from Manchester's Victorian architecture provides another archive of environmental contamination that reveals how industrial pollution affected the built environment as well as natural ecosystems. The limestone facades of buildings constructed during the 1800s absorbed atmospheric pollutants that can still be detected today, creating permanent records of historical air quality that are preserved in the crystal structure of the stone itself. The chemical weathering patterns on Victorian buildings reveal the corrosive effects of atmospheric pollution that went far beyond simple aesthetic damage. Sulfur dioxide emissions from coal combustion created acidic conditions that accelerated the deterioration of limestone and sandstone, while metal particles in the atmosphere catalyzed chemical reactions that caused additional structural damage. The buildings themselves became victims of industrial pollution, suffering ongoing damage that required constant maintenance and eventually led to the peace and demolition of many structures that might otherwise have survived for centuries. The preservation of industrial chemicals and building materials has created unexpected archives of environmental contamination that provide detailed records of atmospheric pollution during specific historical periods. Mortar samples from buildings constructed at different times during the 19th century show systematically changing chemical compositions that reflect evolving industrial processes and emission controls. The mortar acts as a chemical sponge that absorbed atmospheric pollutants during the curing process, preserving them in a stable matrix that maintains chemical integrity for more than a century. The modern environmental legacy of Victorian industrial contamination continues to affect Manchester's landscape in ways that are largely invisible to casual observers, but clearly documented by environmental monitoring. Soil samples from parks and residential areas throughout the city show elevated levels of heavy metals that can be traced directly to 19th century industrial emissions. The contamination is most severe in areas that were downwind from major industrial sites, but elevated levels can be detected throughout the metropolitan area, from the poisoned rivers and contaminated bones of industrial Manchester. Our journey through the landscape of 19th century inequality now carries us up the gentle slopes of Altrincham, 15 miles south of the factory districts, where an entirely different world existed in magnificent isolation from the environmental and human devastation that funded its creation. It's here, surrounded by carefully manicured gardens and breathing air filtered by ancient oak trees, the mill owners and industrialists who profited from the suffering we have witnessed lived lives of unprecedented luxury and refinement. Imagine yourself approaching Dunamassy Hall on a crisp October evening in 1889, the same year that Dr. Franklin was documenting the burning rivers of Manchester, and Sarah Chapman was organizing her fellow workers in the match factories of London. Your carriage follows a winding gravel drive that stretches for more than a mile through parkland that has been shaped by its generations of wealth into an idealized version of the English countryside. Ancient deer graze beneath spreading trees that have never known the acid rain of industrial emissions, while perfectly maintained lawns stretch toward a Georgian mansion that glows with warm light from hundreds of windows. This is the home of Sir Henry Stamford, whose textile empire encompasses 12 mills throughout Lancashire and employs more than 8,000 workers in conditions similar to those we witnessed through the eyes of our young mill worker. The fortune that built this palace was extracted thread by thread from the labor of children whose small hands tied broken cotton fibers in the heat and noise of his spinning rooms. Every element of luxury that surrounds you here was purchased with the health, safety, and childhood of workers whose names Sir Henry has never learned, and whose faces he has never troubled to see. The contrast between this environment and the industrial districts that funded is so complete as to seem almost supernatural. The air here carries the scent of roses and lavender from carefully tended gardens, not the chemical fumes and coal smoke that choke workers in Manchester's factory neighborhoods. The water flowing in ornamental streams and fountains is crystal clear, drawn from private wells that have never been contaminated by industrial waste. The silence is broken only by birdsong and the distant sound of horses moving through well-groomed pastures, not by the thunder of machinery that dominates every waking moment for the workers who create Sir Henry's wealth. Tonight, Sir Henry is hosting a dinner party for fellow industrialists and members of Parliament, a gathering that will bring together the men who control England's emerging industrial economy. The guest list includes cotton mill owners from Manchester and Liverpool, iron masters from Birmingham and Sheffield, railway magnates from across the Midlands, and the politicians whose votes determine the regulatory environment within which their enterprises operate. The conversations that take place over fine wine and elaborate meals will shape industrial policy for decades to come. Yet, none of these men have ever worked on a factory floor or lived in the cramped, polluted neighborhoods where their employees struggle to survive. The mansion itself represents an architectural monument to the wealth that industrial exploitation has made possible. Built in the classical style that was fashionable among the newly rich industrial elite, it features soaring marble columns, intricate plasterwork, and imported furnishings that cost more than most factory workers will earn in their entire lifetimes. The grand staircase is crafted from Italian marble, quarried by workers whose conditions were scarcely better than those in Manchester's mills. While the elaborate wood paneling comes from forests in India and Burma that were clear-cut by colonial labor operating under conditions of virtual slavery. The servants who maintain this opulent environment represent another layer of the economic hierarchy that industrial wealth has created. They are drawn from the same working-class population that supplies labor for the factories. But their employment in domestic service provides them with marginally better living conditions and social status than their counterparts in industrial work. The hierarchy within the servant population mirrors the broader social stratification of industrial society, with skilled positions like butler and head cook commanding respect and relative security, while lower servants like scullery maids and stable boys exist in conditions of near poverty despite their proximity to enormous wealth. The daily routine of managing such an establishment requires coordinated labor of dozens of people whose lives are entirely dedicated to maintaining the comfort and status of the family they serve. The head butler, Mr. Pemberton, has spent 30 years learning the elaborate protocols that govern aristocratic social life, while the head cook, Mrs. Morrison, manages a kitchen staff that prepares meals using ingredients imported from around the world at costs that exceed the annual wages of factory workers. The dinner preparations, alone require the labor of more than 20 people working for the entire day. The dining room must be prepared with china, crystal, and silver that represents the accumulated wealth of generations, while the kitchen staff prepares multiple courses using cooking techniques that require years of specialized training. Footmen who will serve the meal have been trained in the precise movements and gestures that maintain the illusion of effortless luxury, while the wine steward oversees the selection of vintages that cost more per bottle than most workers earn in a month. The menu for tonight's dinner reflects the global reach of British industrial and imperial power. The first course features oysters from Scotland and France, followed by turtle soup made from creatures captured in the Caribbean. The fish course includes salmon from Irish rivers and sole from the English Channel, while the meat courses feature venison from Sir Henry's own deer park and beef from cattle raised on his Scottish estates. The vegetables come from his private hothouses, where tropical and Mediterranean produce is cultivated using heating systems powered by coal, extracted from mines that he also owns. The wine selection represents another form of conspicuous consumption that demonstrates the host's wealth and sophistication. The champagne is from the finest houses in the Reims region. The claret comes from prestigious Bordeaux estates, and the port has been aging in Sir Henry's cellars for more than 20 years. The total cost of the wine served at a single dinner party exceeds the annual income of 50 factory families, yet it is consumed as casually as water by men who regard such extravagance as their natural right. The conversation over dinner reveals the attitudes and assumptions that allow these men to maintain their wealth while remaining psychologically insulated from the human costs of their business practices. They discuss their factories and workers in the same abstract terms they might use to talk about livestock or machinery. Viewing labor as simply another input in the production process that must be managed for maximum efficiency and minimum cost. The actual conditions endured by their employees are rarely mentioned, and when worker complaints arise, they're dismissed as evidence of ingratitude or outside agitation. Segment 4.2. The Arithmetic of Suffering and Profit. The morning after Sir Henry's elaborate dinner party brings the quiet routine of a household sustained by industrial wealth, where every comfort and convenience depends on the continued exploitation of workers, so suffering remains as invisible as the air they breathe. as sunlight filters through pristine windows into rooms where no trace of Manchester's industrial smoke can penetrate. The daily business of managing a fortune built on human misery begins with the same casual efficiency that characterizes all aristocratic pursuits. Sir Henry's study, where he conducts the financial calculations that determine the fate of thousands of workers, presents a scene of refined comfort that stands in stark contrast to the environment where his wealth is actually created. Persian carpets muffle the sound of his footsteps as he moves between a mahogany desk that costs more than a factory worker's lifetime earnings and leather-bound ledgers that record profit margins measured in human pain. The walls are lined with first edition books that serve primarily as decoration, the pristine condition revealing that their owners' interests lie in accumulating wealth rather than accumulating knowledge. The Morning Mail brings reports from the managers of Sir Henry's 12 textile mills, documents that translate the daily struggle of 8,000 workers into neat columns of numbers that never convey the human reality behind the statistics. Production figures for the previous week show that Mill Number 7 has exceeded its quota by 3%, a result achieved by extending working hours and intensifying the pace of work 2 levels that will inevitably lead to increased accidents and health problems. The report makes no mention of these human costs, focusing instead on the additional profit margin that such productivity increases have generated. The financial records revealed the ruthless efficiency with which Sir Henry has organized his industrial empire to extract maximum value from human labor while minimizing costs. The average wage paid to his workers has remained essentially unchanged for 5 years. Despite steady increases in productivity and the cost of living, the savings generated by this wage stagnation flow directly into Sir Henry's personal accounts, funding the lifestyle of luxury that surrounds him while his employees struggle to afford basic necessities. The safety expenditures recorded in the mill accounts demonstrate the calculated indifference to worker welfare that characterizes industrial management. Sir Henry spends less on safety equipment for all 12 of his mills than he spent on wine for last night's dinner party. The decision to forego safety improvements that could prevent accidents and save lives is made purely on economic grounds, with the cost of occasional compensation payments to injured workers' families calculated as less expensive than investing in protective equipment. The correspondence with mill managers reveals the systematic dehumanization of workers that allows such exploitation to continue without troubling the conscience of those who profit from it. Workers are referred to by numbers rather than names, their individual circumstances and needs reduced to abstract categories that facilitate administrative efficiency. A mother of 3 children who has worked in Mill Number 4 for 8 years becomes simply Employee 347, whose recent absence due to illness is noted as a productivity deficit that must be addressed through disciplinary action. The reports of worker organizing activities receive particular attention from Sir Henry, who regards any form of collective action by his employees as a threat to his property rights and industrial authority. The managers have been instructed to identify potential troublemakers and to document their activities in detailed reports that read like intelligence briefings on enemy operations. Workers who ask questions about safety conditions or suggest improvements in working procedures are classified as agitators whose influence must be neutralized through isolation, harassment, or dismissal. The financial projections for the coming quarter reveal Sir Henry's plans to further intensify exploitation in response to increased competition from other manufacturers. Wage cuts of 5% are planned across all mills, justified by claims of economic necessity, despite the substantial profits recorded in previous quarters. The reduction in workers' already minimal incomes will force families deeper into poverty while generating additional revenue that will fund further expansion of Sir Henry's industrial empire. The environmental costs of industrial production appear in the mill accounts only as occasional line items for fines paid to local authorities for pollution violations. These penalties are so minimal compared to the profits generated by unrestricted waste disposal that they function essentially as licensing fees for environmental destruction rather than meaningful deterrents to harmful practices. Sir Henry calculates that paying occasional fines is far less expensive than investing in waste treatment systems that would reduce his mills' environmental impact. The human costs of industrial accidents are recorded with the same dispassionate precision that characterizes all business expenses. The death of a 12-year-old boy in mill number 3, caught in machinery that lacked basic safety guards, is noted as a compensation payment of £15 to the family and a production delay of 2 hours while the machinery was cleaned. The boy's name does not appear in the records, and his death is treated as a minor inconvenience rather than a preventable tragedy. As the afternoon sun streams through the tall windows of Sir Henry's mansion, casting long shadows across Persian carpets that cost more than most families earn in a lifetime, we arrive at the culmination of our journey through the industrial world of the 19th century. The contrast between the opulent comfort of this drawing room and the harsh realities we have witnessed in the textile mills, match factories, and poison rivers of industrial England represents more than simple inequality, reveals the fundamental moral architecture of an economic system that transformed human relationships, environmental systems, and the very meaning of progress itself. The legacy of this industrial transformation extends far beyond the immediate suffering of individual workers or the specific environmental damage inflicted on particular landscapes. The patterns of exploitation, environmental destruction, and social inequality that we have observed in Victorian England established precedents and created institutional structures that continue to shape our world more than a century later. The children who worked in Sir Henry's mills, the young women who struck it brilliant in May, the communities that lived beside burning rivers there, experiences represent not historical curiosities, but the foundational experiences that created the modern industrial world. The technological innovations that made the Industrial Revolution possible came at human and environmental costs that were largely invisible to contemporary observers, but are now clearly documented through the scientific methods we have explored. The steam engines that powered the textile mills created unprecedented productive capacity, but they also created unprecedented levels of air pollution that shortened lives and damaged ecosystems across entire regions. The chemical processes that produced matches, dyes, and other industrial products generated wealth and convenience for some while creating toxic exposures that caused permanent health damage for workers and communities. The social relationships that emerged from industrial production fundamentally altered human societies in ways that persist to the present day. The division between owners and workers that we observed in Sir Henry's mansion and his mills created new forms of social hierarchy based on control over industrial capital rather than traditional sources of authority, like land ownership or hereditary status. The concentration of wealth in the hands of industrial elites established patterns of inequality that continue to characterize capitalist economies, while the organization of workers into large industrial facilities created the conditions for new forms of collective action and political mobilization. The environmental consequences of rapid industrial development, documented through modern scientific analysis of sediment cores, tree rings, and human remains, demonstrate how decisions made during brief periods of intensive economic growth can create environmental changes that persist for centuries or millennia. The heavy metals deposited in Manchester's river sediments during the 1800s remain in the environment today, continuing to pose health risks for contemporary populations. The atmospheric pollution that killed trees and corroded buildings during the Victorian era established precedents for environmental destruction that now operate on a global scale. The moral frameworks that allowed industrial elites like Sir Henry to maintain their sense of righteousness while profiting from human suffering reveal how economic systems can distort ethical reasoning and normalized practices that would be recognized as obviously wrong in other contexts. The social Darwinist ideologies that justified extreme inequality. The paternalistic attitudes that treated workers as children incapable of self-determination. And the utilitarian calculations that weighed human welfare against profit margins created intellectual foundations for systematic exploitation that extended far beyond individual businesses or industries. The resistance movements that emerged from industrial working conditions, exemplified by the Match Girls strike and the countless smaller acts of individual and collective defiance we have witnessed, established traditions of labor organizing and social activism that continue to influence contemporary movements for social justice. Sarah Chapman and her fellow strikers demonstrated that ordinary people facing overwhelming challenges could find ways to organize collectively and achieve meaningful improvements in their circumstances, providing inspiration and practical lessons for future generations of activists. The scientific understanding of environmental and health effects that emerged from studying industrial pollution created new fields of knowledge that continue to inform contemporary environmental protection efforts. The work of researchers like Dr. Franklin in documenting water pollution and Dr. Montgomery in analyzing historical contamination through archaeological methods represents part of a continuous tradition of scientific investigation that connects 19th century environmental problems with current concerns about climate change, toxic pollution, and environmental justice. The international dimensions of industrial development that we observed in the global supply chains supporting Sir Henry's lifestyle reveal how local exploitation connects to worldwide systems of economic inequality. It's the cotton picked by enslaved workers in America, the colonial resources extracted from India and Africa, and the manufactured goods sold in captive markets throughout the British Empire created networks of exploitation that operated on a planetary scale. These patterns of global inequality established during the Industrial Revolution continue to shape international economic relationships in the contemporary world. The political relationships between industrial wealth and governmental power that we witnessed in Sir Henry's dinner party conversations demonstrate how economic inequality can undermine democratic institutions and concentrate political influence in the hands of those who profit from existing arrangements. The ability of industrial elites to shape regulations, influence elections, and control policy decisions created precedents for corporate political influence that continue to affect contemporary governance in industrial societies. The cultural legacies of industrial development include both the magnificent achievements made possible by industrial wealth and the human costs that such achievements extracted from working-class communities. The libraries, museums, universities funded by industrial fortunes represent genuine contributions to human knowledge and cultural development. But they were built on foundations of exploitation that cannot be separated from their beneficial effects. The moral complexity of this legacy requires us to acknowledge both the positive achievements and the negative consequences of industrial development. The technological momentum created by early industrial development established patterns of innovation and production that continue to influence contemporary technology choices and their social consequences. The prioritization of efficiency and profit maximization over worker safety and environmental protection that characterized Victorian industrial development continues to shape how new technologies are developed and deployed. The external costs of technological innovation are still frequently imposed on workers and communities who have little voice in decisions about technological development. The urban environments created by industrial development, including both the factory districts where workers lived and the elite neighborhoods where owners resided, established spatial patterns of inequality that persist in contemporary cities. The geographic segregation that allowed Sir Henry to live upwind from his factories while his workers endured pollution and industrial hazards created precedents for environmental inequality that continue to affect urban planning and development decisions. The educational systems that emerged to serve industrial society reflected the class divisions and power relationships that characterized the broader economic system, the elite schools that prepared wealthy children for positions of authority, and the minimal education provided to working-class children who were expected to supply industrial labor, created different forms of knowledge and capability that reinforced existing inequalities. These educational inequalities continue to shape opportunities and life outcomes in contemporary societies. The family structures and gender relationships that developed in response to industrial working conditions created new forms of social organization that had lasting effects on domestic life and women's roles in society. The separation of home and workplace that occurred when production moved from households to factories changed relationships between men and women, parents and children, and individuals and communities in ways that continue to influence contemporary social arrangements. And so our journey through the industrial landscapes of 19th century England draws to its close. It's like the end of a long winter, giving way to the promise of spring. We have walked together through the clattering halls of textile mills where children's hands worked among dangerous machinery, witnessed the courage of young women who dared to strike against impossible odds, examined the poisoned rivers that bore witness to environmental destruction on an unprecedented scale, and stood in the opulent mansions built on foundations of human suffering. These stories from more than a century ago speak to us across time, not as relics of a distant past, but as mirrors reflecting the continuing challenges of our own era. The Industrial Revolution that transformed Victorian England established patterns of technological development, economic inequality, and environmental destruction that continue to shape our world today. The courage demonstrated by workers like Sarah Chapman, scientific dedication of researchers like Dr. Franklin, and even the moral failures of industrialists like Sir Henry, all represent aspects of human nature that persist in contemporary responses to technological change and social challenge. The children who tied broken threads in Manchester's mills teach us about resilience in the face of overwhelming hardship, while their shortened lives remind us of the human costs of prioritizing economic efficiency over human welfare. The match girls who walked out of Bryant and May's factory demonstrate how ordinary people can challenge seemingly insurmountable systems of power, while their victory shows that collective action can achieve meaningful change even under the most difficult circumstances. The poisoned rivers of industrial Manchester, revealed through modern scientific analysis to have been even more contaminated than contemporary observers realized, illustrate how environmental destruction can persist for centuries beyond the industrial activities that created it. The molecular witnesses preserved in sediments, tree rings, and human bones provide testimony to environmental damage that serves as both historical evidence and contemporary warning. The contrast between the luxury of industrial mansions and the poverty of workers' tenements reveals how economic systems can create extreme inequality while providing moral justifications for exploitation. The wealth that funded aristocratic lifestyles and cultural achievements was extracted from workers who had little choice but to accept whatever conditions their employers chose to impose. Yet, even in the darkest aspects of this industrial transformation, we find evidence of human dignity, mutual support, and the persistent hope for better conditions that motivated both individual survival and collective resistance. The friendships formed between child workers, the solidarity demonstrated during strikes, and the gradual development of scientific understanding about environmental and health effects, all represent forms of progress that emerged from struggle and suffering as you drift toward sleep tonight, carried by the gentle rhythm of this historical meditation. Remember that you are part of a continuing story that began with the industrial transformation we have explored together, the technologies that provide your comfort and safety, the political institutions that protect your rights, and the environmental protections that preserve the air and water upon which your life depends, all evolved from responses to the challenges faced by the people whose stories we have shared. Their experiences remind us that the future is not predetermined, but emerges from the countless individual and collective choices that people make in response to the circumstances they face. The workers who organized strikes, the scientists who documented environmental damage, and even the wealthy industrialists who shaped economic policy all exercised forms of agency that influenced the direction of historical change. In the warmth of your bed, breathing clean air and drinking safe water, you inherit both the benefits of their struggles and a responsibility to continue their work of creating a more just and sustainable world. Their legacy lives on in the choices you make about how to respond to contemporary challenges of technological change, economic inequality, and environmental protection. Sleep now with gratitude for their sacrifices and determination to honor their memory through your own commitment to justice, compassion, and the patient work of building a better world for future generations. In your dreams, may you find the wisdom to learn from their example and the courage to face the challenges of your own time with the same dignity and hope that sustained them through the smoke and struggle of the Industrial Revolution. The gentle silence that follows their stories carries within it the echo of machinery finally stilled, the peace of rivers running clean, the promise that human ingenuity and compassion can still prevail over the forces that would sacrifice human welfare for private gain. Rest well, knowing that their story continues in the choices you will make tomorrow and in all the tomorrows that follow.